Socrates said an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe and share this podcast with family and friends, a show where we examine life contained with philosophies, ideas and their consequences on today's culture. I am Rainer Thermal and this is Hey Culture.
Okay. Hello, my name is Richard Howe. I'm Provost and Norman L. Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary in the United States. And I am just so excited to be with you. My wife, Rebecca, and I have visited your country, at least for the viewers here who are actually in South Africa, a number of times. We can't wait to get God willing. So looking forward to a great conversation about philosophy's interaction with what we care about in our theology and Bible understanding and things like that today. So such a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure and a privilege to have you on. That is a new first for the episode to have the guest start us off. And to everybody out there, welcome to Hey Culture. Today we have Dr. Richard Howe. There's a product placement there. If you want to have a good theological education, SES is the place to go. So welcome to the show, Dr. Richard.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. It's such a privilege, and just look forward to these kind of conversations. You know, we touch on issues that I think, at least in my experience, that are not obviously important in the minds of a lot of my fellow Christians and churchgoers, right? And so trying to connect the dots as to why some of this stuff matters is one of the things I'm all about, to show the connection, not in a self-serving way, like, hey, you need Reno and me around. It's not that. It's just that, as we'll find out, people can be unduly influenced by bad thinking without their even realizing it, sort of by osmosis. And so we want to see if we can point out some of those things and a good remedy to that, and so that it doesn't sabotage one's understanding of the scriptures or otherwise understanding of God. That's one of the things that matters a lot to me.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's the first time I heard, like, I'm big on the fact that ideas have consequences, but that's the first time I'm hearing it being compared to osmosis. And I think that's a really good comparison.
Yeah, this is unconscious, in other words. We're not suggesting that people deliberately shop through a lot of ideas and pick the worst ones. I mean, probably no Christian would deliberately do that, but we can be unduly influenced. And in my experience, again, as a probably a lot of people's experiences, you grow in the Lord and you grow in your understanding. It usually takes somebody else to point out misunderstandings, either reading a book, hearing a podcast, talking to friends, listening to a sermon, and you get confronted with a opposing point of view and how they're incompatible and why one is more likely to be true than the other. And you hear the arguments. It's hard to do just on your own, in your own resources. That's what commends reading, podcasts, sermons, and these kind of inputs to help us be on track as much as possible this side of heaven.
Yes. And so for the guests out there, today's episode will be on is philosophy important or not, and why does it matter? Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Howe, to kick us off, what is philosophy?
So it's funny, I have in a presentation that I do on this subject, it looks like I'm going to get serious with how do we define philosophy? And I heard someone say, and I thought this was hilarious, that they say, well, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. I don't remember where I was when I first learned that, botanically speaking, technically a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put tomatoes in a fruit salad. Okay. So then philosophy is wondering whether that makes tomato sauce a smoothie or not.
That is funny.
If you wonder, well, if tomato is a fruit, then doesn't that make tomato sauce a smoothie? It's like, somehow that just doesn't seem right and such. But, probably with respect to a lot of formal disciplines that have been identified and codified in Western intellectual history, not unlike a lot of others, it's hard to define at the front end as accurately as it is downstream once one has engaged in it. A book that I used when I was a graduate student, I taught undergraduate philosophy, a textbook I used by a philosopher named Ed Miller in his book, Questions That Matter. He defined philosophy basically as thinking rationally and critically about life's most important questions. So rationally would just mean without undue interference from emotions. So sometimes we can be driven by a visceral reaction, and it might make us reject something or accept something for no reasons, but just the feelings and the emotions. And emotions are fine, but they shouldn't drive the thinking process. They should sort of follow it. So we want to think rationally, and we don't want to. We also want to think critically. That word has kind of gotten a lot of bad connotations in English especially with the rise of critical theory and critical race theory and these kind of things. But broadly, critical just means subjecting something to a proper critique. So there, what Miller's getting at is you don't want to just be gullible. You don't want to just believe everything you hear. Like the meme that was on the internet, it said you could pick your favorite politician from a long time ago. It said, "Do not believe everything you hear and see on the internet. Abraham Lincoln." It's like, wait a minute, Abraham Lincoln, you couldn't have possibly said that, So that's what the joke is. It's like, well, just because somebody puts a meme up and attaches a name to it of a famous person, you don't necessarily just accept it uncritically, right? So you want to be rational, subjecting things to proper critique as grown-ups. So when we do that about particular kinds of questions, like, is there a God? What is truth? What about human morality or morality in general, goodness? What is the purpose of life? Where did we come from? Those sort of cosmic questions, if you will, have largely been the purview of the philosopher, going all the way back in Western intellectual history to the ancient Greeks, centuries before the time of Christ. So that's what it is. Now, how it feels to do it and what are the specifics to do it, we'll get into some of that, I'm sure, but that's sort of the broad definition of what philosophy. And so just the last thing that as it comes to my mind, it can be distinguished from other kind of relatively narrow focuses on aspects of reality. So you can study astronomy. Well, that would be an in-depth examination of the heavenly bodies, or you could study botany, looking at plants, or you could study medicine or physics or chemistry and all these things. And if you could think of them as various aspects of reality, the philosopher is uniquely equipped to look at reality as such, not reality as, plants or as astronomy or as this, but reality as reality. And that, again, historically has been the purview of the philosophers.
Is it then possible to not be engaged in philosophy?
So this is a great question, because think about this way. Suppose you and a friend walk outside and it's a bright sunny day, and then one of them comments, what a bright sunny day it is. Well, likely you wouldn't say, hey, you must be an astronomer, or you must be doing astronomy. You go, no, I was just observing that it was a bright sunny day. So, but what we would say is if someone took the idea of bright sunny day, like the sun and the light of the sun, and started doing an in-depth analysis of that would be astronomy, right? Oh, what a pretty tree over there. Oh, you must be a botanist. Well, no, I'm just observing that there's a pretty tree. But a certain depth of analysis into the nature of the tree or other plants, that would be botany. So you can think of, okay, there are things that we might encounter in life, an in-depth analysis of which would be philosophy. So while it might not be easy to see how someone could be tripped up by a misunderstanding of the sun, right? We're not going to go, well, you've got a misconception of the sun, and so that's really has such a deleterious influence in your life now. Now, there is a time from history when that was actually true. Maybe we'll use that as an illustration here later. But right now, observing a tree, observing the sun, okay, maybe you had a misperception about how fast light goes or how far away the sun is. Probably not going to have any deleterious influence on the rest of your life. But I think there are things that we encounter that the philosopher is uniquely equipped to do that in-depth analysis that even at a shallow level could really impact deleteriously someone's life. I'll give you just one example, because we're plagued by this in a lot of places. I know in South Africa's dealing with these issues as we are in the U.S., and that is, suppose someone said, you give them, hey, I believe the Bible is true, and you're trying to maybe witness to them, and they go, oh, well, that's your truth, that's not my truth. You go, wait, what? I mean, I can understand some truths being relative, like, Boer de Vors may taste good to this person and not to that person. Okay. Or it might feel comfortable in the room, but it might be a little warm for somebody else. That makes sense. But, objective things of reality, whether it's raining or whether it's sunny, can't be, well, it's raining for you, but it's sunshine for me, except in maybe some poetic sense, right? So there are objective truths, and we're trying to get people to understand, no, when we say the Bible is true, we mean it literally is true, and not just true for one and true for another. Well, the very notion that someone could have that relativist view of truth itself is an indication that somewhere upstream they've been influenced by bad philosophy, even if they've never heard the word philosophy, even if they've never engaged in it, never read a book. Just by osmosis, by the culture around us, we absorb these bad thinking, and in some instances it may really have devastating impact, because then we start considering the fact that, well, there's a God for you, not a God for me, or there's a heaven and hell for you, there's not one for me. You go, no, there either is or isn't a God. That's a factual question. So the onus is on us to try to discover what is the objective truth about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of brings up my next question then. If I think of in the realm of believers, doesn't the Bible then warn us to not be taken captive by philosophy, and to not engage in worldly things?
Yes. So that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the first objections that a Christian who's studying philosophy might run into from their fellow Christians. Colossians 2:8 says, basically saying, do not be deceived or taken captive by this vain philosophy and empty deceit and such. What I would suggest is, even at a minimal sense, there is a sense in which a person might need to be wary of the dangers of philosophy in order to help fend it off in their own life and also help others. Like by analogy, we're glad that there are physicians who study diseases. Of course, diseases are not to be played around with. They're not for fun. They're serious and can be life-threatening. But we recognize the value of the physician who studies those diseases to do two things. One, to help us prevent getting sick, or if having gotten sick, help us get well. So by analogy, even if minimally the scriptures were warning us that philosophy is this empty deceit that's out there to scandalize it, even if that was the case, then I think we can be grateful that there are thinkers who've gone before us who understand the dangers to do the same two things: keep us from getting infected, if you will, by bad thinking, or having been infected, like the relativism of truth, help us come out of that. So I think this is what C.S. Lewis had in mind. And I love this. I think it's a signature line on one of my email addresses. It says, bad philosophy or good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than bad philosophy needs to be answered. Right. And I think he's echoing a sentiment from centuries earlier, Thomas Aquinas, when he said, because the teacher of sacred scripture must at times oppose the philosophers, he must make use of philosophy. So at least in that negative sense, it still commends itself to be the subject of study for some of us. Now, I think it's more than that, but even there is saying a big thing to say, okay, well, Paul's not telling you to just totally ignore it. In fact, Norm Geisler said in a public address once, he said, we cannot beware of philosophy unless we first be aware of philosophy. Right.
Oh, that's good. That's nicely put.
Yeah, exactly. So, but even more to the point of your question, I don't think in context, Paul is talking about philosophy as we identify that as a subject matter, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, whomever. Because in the context, in fact, when I bring this up in talking to an audience, and I will just ask, does anybody know what chapter 2 of Colossians goes on to say? In other words, this verse in context. And almost never have I had anybody remember. Well, frankly, I don't remember what the rest of chapter 2 of Colossians is all about. I just remember that one verse that was hammered into my head. Well, what Paul goes on to, I think, give examples of the philosophy, which is this vain deceit, was an insidious form of legalism that was plaguing the Colossians, a really early form of Gnosticism, where Gnosticism, among other things, thought that the physical world was either non-existent or just totally inconsequential, and so or even evil, some spectrum there among the Gnostic. And so you just, taste not, touch not, handle not, is what Paul goes on, where people were telling the Colossians. He said, these things have the appearance of being religious, but are of no use in curtailing the indulgences of the flesh. Just saying, I'm not going to eat this, I'm not going to touch that, is not how you're sanctified, is what he's saying. So I think he was warning them about a particular philosophy. In fact, I'm telling you more than you wanted to know with your question, but I think from sources that I've studied, Nicole and Alford and other Greek exegetes, they suggest that probably a better way that the Greek can be, or at least an alternative way it can be translated, is beware of the philosophy which is vain deceit. It's a particular philosophy, namely that nascent form of Gnosticism, I think Paul was warning about. Now, maybe that doesn't deflect every legitimate criticism about studying philosophy or every legitimate warning that someone may have. So we can get into that as we go along. But at least in toto, it doesn't just, I don't think the Colossians 2:8 passage has anything to do with saying Christians shouldn't do philosophy, because either negatively we need to do it to be aware of it, and then as we'll hopefully get into positively, it can actually help us in doing a lot of things that we cherish in our theology.
So would it be more accurate to say that Paul doesn't warn us against philosophy as a whole, but specifically against bad philosophy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, to be sure, we might have a disagreement in the broader conversation about what constitutes bad and good philosophy, but at least the principle, I think, is there for us to be able to engage it at some level.
Because my guess is, being a philosopher yourself, going down this road, having most probably family members that doesn't necessarily understand why you're doing what you're doing, or having friends that don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, or people in church even. What are some of the common arguments or things that you heard that people gave you against philosophy, that you shouldn't be doing it?
Yeah, so of course, probably the most common would have been that very one. You would find people like, say, John MacArthur, and he's got several installments, both audio as well as blog entries, talking about philosophy as just deleterious and antithetical to Christian thinking and such. So, it's funny, when I first started studying philosophy formally, I'd had philosophy courses as part of a broader curriculum as an undergraduate student in a university. And then studying apologetics, you invariably get into some philosophical things, but for reasons that aren't probably particularly interesting to your viewers right now, I took some advice from my mentor, Norman Geisler, who co-founded our seminary. When I was a student of his at Dallas Theological Seminary, he suggested that I go back to university and study philosophy formally. Back then, you didn't have as much opportunities to study apologetics formally at that level. It just wasn't happening like it is today, like at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where you can study apologetics and philosophy. Another product play. I want to abuse the product placement privilege here.
But I think both you and your wife sorry, I just want to say, I think both you and your wife are the king and queen of product placements. I remember at that one conference. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, there's one right there, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe you can see SES mug sitting there. So here I am now. I'm in a master's degree program at a state university, studying philosophy. And it was funny, the reactions I got from my fellow Christians, because some of them were curious. They didn't know what philosophy was. Some of them even thought it was the same as psychology. I guess they both start with a P. Maybe that was it. But some of them were a little suspicious about the study. They weren't really sure. It wasn't obvious to them why it would be helpful. And they were worried that it may be more harmful than helpful. And then others were outright hostile, like, say, Jeffrey Johnson at a Bible college here in the United States, who's written somewhat against Thomas Aquinas and the role of philosophy and how bad it is and such. Or as I mentioned, John MacArthur. And I'm not just slamming them. I'm just saying you've got God-loving, Bible-loving Christians who think this is a terrible thing to do. So they're just outright hostile to it. So I had that whole spectrum. So the only thing to do was to try to, sometimes people aren't motivated to make a change until the need to make the change is made a felt need. It's one thing to have a real need, but if you don't sometimes feel the real need, that is, it's not a felt need, you're not motivated. You might have a nail stuck in your foot, but if your foot's numb and you don't know that the nail is there, you might not be motivated to pull the nail out. But the pain that the nail causes is the thing that motivates you to pull the nail out, right? So by analogy, sometimes people might need to see how bad philosophy needs to be answered. And in many instances, the bad philosophy is not with solid biblical, because it may be stuff that's prior to coming to the Bible, like truth. The Bible doesn't tell you what truth is. When God said, "You shall not eat the tree lest you die," and Satan said, "You will not die." Well, they didn't have this, as far as we know from the text. Okay, hang on. Let's have a thing in logic here. Here's the law of non-contradiction, and A cannot be A and not A. They didn't do that. It was as if by virtue of being in the image of God, Eve knew that it couldn't be true that you will die at the same time that it's true you will not die in exactly the same way, right? And so you go, okay, so somebody that's being challenged or affected in their mind to think that contradictions could actually be true, then somebody's got to triage that thinking in their mind. And usually the way to do that, or at least sometimes at least, is good philosophy, whatever that ends up looking like.
Okay, then that brings me to my next question. Then, what are some of the bad philosophies that people should be aware of nowadays?
Yes. So we've already made a reference, didn't give it a name, but this sort of relativism about truth. And by the way, in the United States, being confronted in the general marketplace of ideas with the relativism about morality, that's been around for more than a generation in the culture, where what is right or wrong is just relative to the person in terms of conduct, right? So don't impose your morality on me, that kind of thing. That's been around for generations, and that's the product of some bad philosophy. This most recent that we made a reference to with the relativism about truth, now that's been percolating in the universities for more than maybe a generation, but it's finally trickled down into the marketplace, is basically some aspect of postmodernism, where depending on the postmodernist you read, truth is sort of a consensus that we come to as a society, or truth is really, or wrangling and fighting over truth are really political. It's power struggle. This is what we see in the critical theory kind of idea, that claims of objective truth in the traditional sense are really just subtle and sometimes not so subtle attempts to subjugate other people and bring them into some kind of intellectual slavery, if you will. And so we need to break free from these things and understand that truth is relative. It's trickled into Christianity, and people like Stanley Grenz would be one example, where also Robert Weber is another contemporary evangelical who would, and by evangelical in the U.S. use of that term, I mean a conservative Protestantism, where we're all swimming in our own history and our own perspective, and so we have to factor that in, our own biases when we read a text like the Bible. We're always bringing our own history as a thinking person, and our own cultural context and our own biases, and we have to bring, those inevitably come into the equation. You just go, well, that's a tacit way to saying there's nothing in that biblical text that is immune to biases. That's objectively true that a human being can know. But the problem with that statement is the book that they talk about that, like Grenz's primer on postmodernism, the book that he's writing purports to be an objective treatment of the problem. he writes a sentence. Well, everybody comes to these questions with their own bias. And I go, well, is that statement you just made just your own bias? Because if he says no, then he just contradicted himself. If he says yes, then why should I take it to be true? Because that's just your bias. And as simplistic as that sounds, people would be startled how self-refuting a lot of these things are. But that's just two examples, just a reference to moral relativism, that is sort of relegated to the individual, to the culture. Who are we to criticize this culture? That's the way they do things, that kind of thinking is morality. And then our relativism about truth. One other that maybe we can turn to, I want you to just take it the way you want to go. But the thing that means the most to me lately in the past few years is how, because to the degree that we've lost our connection with how God has revealed himself through nature, through creation, as Romans 1:20 says, we're losing our ability to understand scriptural references to God, and when those references are speaking figuratively or not about God, right? So when Psalm says that he will bring us under his wings and feathers, so far I've not found anybody that really tried to argue that God is like a big bird, right? So far. But other things that the Bible said, 2 Samuel 7, God's moving around in the tent. It's not a theophany. He just says, when are you going to build me my house? Because I've been moving in this tent. And you go, I thought God was omnipresent. How could he be moving in a tent? Or Genesis 3, he's walking around the garden. How can he walk around? Does he have legs? That doesn't make sense. Those kind of things. And I think it's a sound natural theology, that is, truths about God that we can discern from creation, that guard against improper understanding of Scripture. Just to tease for further conversation, probably one that hits the closest to home as far as infecting conservative Protestantism to some extent is the idea that God can't know the future. He can't know free choices of his creatures. He can't know what you're going to freely choose for lunch tomorrow, right? And they'll appeal to the Bible and verses of Scripture that make it look like God regretted what he did. Like, well, I didn't know they were going to do that, and the language seems to say that. And people go, well, God didn't know they were going to do this. Is that really true? And if it's not true, what do I do with this verse? How do I know it's not true? And I think a lot of that involves philosophical methods and tools and data to fend those off.
If you want to, we can get a bit into that.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Is what you're referring to, is that what we call, I think it was called theistic personalism or open theism? Is that what you're referring to? Absolutely.
So the most of the people that are classical theists would regard as theistic personalists, which they don't really use that label for themselves. I think a lot of labels that get attached to thinking or to groups of people were always given to them by somebody else. I think the Baptists were called that way by other people, and then the Methodists were called that way by other, but eventually just gets sort of stuck. But be that as it may. But the theistic personalists tend to be more prone to making some of these anthropomorphisms into literal. Probably open theism is not one of them. I mean, some of the more formidable, quote, theistic personalists are strident critics of open theism, which is the idea that the future is open to God. So at least to that level, the theistic personalist hasn't gone so far. I'm thinking of some people like William Lane Craig, for example. And again, he wouldn't call himself a theistic personalist, but for the lack of a better cataloging for our purposes, he would be stridently anti-open theist in terms of God's knowledge of the future. But your point remains that things like the open theist who believes that God, for example, is temporal, as Craig would argue, what he would call omnitemporal rather than timeless, is one thing. And typically, without oversimplifying it, it's called theistic personalism by its detractors. I think Brian Davis from Oxford coined the phrase. It's called that because it, in his mind, it's culling too much from how we understand persons at the human level and then apply those to God, almost like anthropomorphic, right? So that's where it comes from. So I do a presentation, and all of these things, if I mention I do a presentation, it's likely a PDF of the slides of that presentation are available on our website, richardghowe.com. There's another shameless self-promotion there, besides the product placement for Southern Evangelical Seminary. But
I'll link that in the
richardghowe.com.
description.
Yeah, thank you. And at the top, there's a resources tab, and then you click on PDF decks. You can find, and there's one titled God Fading Away. And what I argue in that presentation is I give a picture of what I think is a fairly unified consensus of the classical attributes of God: timeless, spaceless, simple, all-knowing, all-loving, these kind of things, immaterial. And I try to give a litany of luminaries from history touting these kind of attributes to show that now, even in conservative Protestant circles, they're starting to drop off. God's fading away. And that's what the presentation does. At the end, I try to give how do we respond to these? And I have a section of that presentation called Classical Theism in 12 Not So Easy Steps, because that would take obviously another whole presentation to do, which you can get some of those there as well. But I just invite your viewers to get that, to get a picture. And it's always changing. I'm trying to always augment it with new examples and such. But the classical attributes of God, I worry about how much those are fading in contemporary Protestant. So we're not particularly surprised what liberal Christians do, right? We're kind of, we sort of expect nothing better. But when it starts impacting a conservative Protestant that has a high view of the authority of Scripture, maybe even inerrant Scripture, and a high regard for the role of theology and all kinds of things that are exemplary about it, but still are studying to, I think, drop the ball, to use a American football metaphor. It bothers me, and that's one of them that's near and dear to my heart.
Okay, those 12 steps that you mentioned, those are then steps that we could use as classical theists or conservative Christians to kind of engage with that bad ideas. That's
right. I don't remember if I call them steps or points or something like that. And of course, each one of them, just merely stating what it is not sufficient to prove that it's a smart thing to do. So people who are already studying philosophy may look at that and go, well, I'm not so sure about that. But what I try to do there is summarize in these 12 points or whatever, the basics of this classical metaphysics that you find picked up by the church fathers from the ancient Greeks, primarily Plato and Aristotle, and how that got inculcated into the way a lot of things in basic Christian doctrines were formulated: the Trinity, the two natures of Christ. They're trafficking in these categories, giving them sometimes new or altered meanings, to be sure. I mean, Aristotle didn't have a concept of creation. He didn't have a concept of God like we understand that today as Christians, these kind of things. But nevertheless, at some level, philosophically, or the metaphysics get brought in by the church fathers to understand basic truths about God. And you go back in time, I mean, the Jews more or less understood these things. I mean, I mentioned 2 Samuel 7, where God is saying, when are you going to build my house? I've been moving around in this tent. Interestingly, you continue reading, when Solomon builds the temple, what is Solomon's commentary? He says, the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I built? So you read that and you go, okay, well, earlier, it's like God's in a tent. He's, in effect, omnipresent. So one of those is a figure of speech, and the other is more properly speaking about God. The scriptures don't tell you which one's which, does it? That's the problem. The scriptures don't tell you that. What I would submit is creation tells you that. As Romans 1:20, Paul says, since the beginning of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood through the things that are made, right? So somehow from what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, we can come to an understanding of God in these classical attributes, as Christians have done. You wouldn't have to do that, I think, in a lot of situations. Now, you can judge whether this is likely or less likely to be true in a typical encounter with a fellow South African. But I know in the part of the United States I live, if I just give you one example, you cut me off when I'm rambling too much. If you just said to somebody, hey, you know what? Science has proven that the universe came into existence a finite time ago. with Big Bang, whatever you appeal to. If you just said that, I think, to many people, and you go, therefore it must have a cause, I think people would just go, well, that sounds like God to me. I mean, who else is in the business of making universes except God? And they would connect the dots. But because of the influence of bad philosophical thinking, then you could have a brilliant scientist like a Richard Dawkins or a Victor Stenger or Krauss look that creation right in the face, and they go, oh yeah, well, who created the creator? Who designed the designer? Who made God? You go, wow, this guy over here immediately got it. And so we celebrate that. But this person over here, like your Dawkins or your Stingers or your Kraus's or others we could name, who are brilliant, but they don't make the connection. I go, something's gone wrong somewhere. And as self-serving as it is to say, I think at least a large part of the problem is bad philosophical influences. And here, the three people I named are scientists. Dawkins is a zoologist, and Stenger and Krauss are both. Stinger's an astronomer, I think, and I think Krauss is a cosmologist, astrophysicist, or something like that. I probably got that wrong. So in other words, they're all scientists. They're brilliant, but they've been scandalized by bad philosophy, in my judgment. And it didn't happen overnight, did it? Right? No, it's like
no, it did not.
This sort of erosion over the course of more than a century, I think.
Yes, and that specifically not only impacts religion or the academic realm, but that eventually impacts culture, like you mentioned earlier, postmodernism percolating down. And that kind of brings me into a question that came up as you were speaking. So being an American, I know, and being well-traveled and versed and knowing, and I've seen the world, that in terms of media, the rest of the world is watching you guys. We follow your elections. Our TV shows are American TV shows. So my question is, as you guys are heading up towards an election at the moment, how much do you see bad philosophies impacting the culture? Just looking at the divide and the atmosphere heading towards this election.
So there are so many touch points there, and they're not new necessarily, even if they're at a higher level of rhetoric than they've been. Most of them are not new. Fundamental things that are precious to our history as Americans, like the function of government. And so when the colonies broke away from King George and wrote out their Declaration of Independence, this is not a legal document in the U.S., but it sort of is insight into the milieu, politically and philosophically and otherwise, of the what we call the founding fathers of the United States. It's an insight into the context within which then the U.S. Constitution is written. There's some really critical points that come through, because it starts out, they're basically declaring to the world why we think we have the right to sever our connections with the Great Britain and start another country. So the text reads out at the beginning, because it touches on a couple of important points. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to sever the political connections they have with another and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind require that they give a reason which impel them to the separation. So right there, they're basing the very inauguration of at least in their minds, how they understood why this was morally justified, that the laws of nature and nature's God entitle. Well, what do they mean by laws of nature? Well, I mean, gravity is a law of nature, or electricity, but they mean the moral law, that there were laws that imbue that nature's imbued with by God that transcend government. Right? Now, we could disagree as to what some of those laws might be, but just the very principle that there is a creator, and he's endowed us with, as the text goes on, he says, which impelled them to this separation, then it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, now there's philosophical, epistemological question right there about self-evident truths, which are truths that as soon as you hear it, you know it's true without more foundational argument, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, and this is what impacts us in our election. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And then governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. And you go, okay. So now we're starting to get into fights about what role ought government to play versus other roles ought government to play. What has happened in the U.S. is the federal government especially has become a nanny state, from womb to tomb, some people say, that it wants to regulate your kitchen appliances and what kind of car you drive and the food that you eat. In other words, it doesn't trust the rank and file American to make decisions for themselves. A bureaucracy wants to make that for you because we know better. This is sort of, I don't mean to slam Plato, but this is sort of a Platonism. These philosopher kings, oh, we're the only ones that have the insights into the world to really know how to run things. Like a parent would tell a child, why can't I do that, Mommy? You don't even understand why you can't do that. But right now it's good enough for you that I tell you can't. That's the way U.S. government has become. And so that's at stake in these elections, is people that tend more towards this nanny state kind of mentality versus other things. And then that falls out to issues like abortion. When you no longer believe that people are endowed with inalienable rights like life, that's the first one mentioned, then right there it opens the door for taking the life of the unborn. Rebecca just pointed out to me earlier, we were in a conversation, and she said, you realize the first person to recognize Jesus as the Christ was in the womb. It's like, wow, because it was John the Baptist, remember? When Mary comes to Elizabeth and it leaps in her womb.
Yeah, that's amazing.
He knew right there in the womb. So as a Christian, we understand why that's the case. The problem is, as I tell my fellow Americans, we don't have the luxury, I think, to wait until every American becomes a Christian, and then let's talk about the sanctity of life in the womb. I think God has given us a means and principle to deal with that issue in a way that is relatively indifferent as to whether you're a Christian or not. That's because these things tap into moral truths that are part of the fabric of creation that come from the Maker. And even people that don't believe there's a Maker and don't believe that the world is His creation, they're still part of it. So there's got to be a way we can appeal to that theater to gain knowledge enough to make a case for the sanctity of life, among other things, in the womb. And that process is going to involve philosophy. In fact, the more technical or more narrow label would be natural law theory. It's an unfortunate phrase only because today, at least in the States, if you say natural law, people are going to think gravity, electromagnetism, that kind of stuff. But it means natural moral law. It's natural because it's two things. It's knowable by means of nature, that we look around, that what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. And second, it's natural in the sense that it's knowable by our natural faculties of reason. Well, that's called philosophy. Okay. And there's good and there's bad out there, but that's what it is, natural law theory. And it's our heritage, I would argue, as Americans, even though it's pretty much faded away too. And in the conversation, there's more to it, but I think I probably told you. I tell my students sometimes I'm threatening to start a podcast titled "More Than You Wanted to Know." So they ask me a question, and then 15 minutes later they go, "I'm doing fine," and you would have been a sufficient answer.
You don't have to worry. I usually no, I usually tend to want to know more, but we can proceed. But just as a comment on that, from my side, I know we are praying that you guys will have the best possible outcome at the end of this year. Yeah. So
very much.
You're more than welcome. More than welcome, because I think your politics affects the rest of the world's politics. So that is important. Then I just want to open my phone here to get the next point I wanted to ask you. We kind of touched on a lot of this already, but what are some of the clear consequences of not engaging with philosophy?
So I think the main thing is being influenced unduly to think a certain way or act a certain way that we might not have thought or acted left to our own devices. That is, we're being subtly influenced. I think that can happen not even just with philosophy, but a lot of things, but certainly with philosophy. And I think it's largely, just the saturation from peer pressure and culture that we're just obviously and unavoidably immersed in. We don't want to be monks that if monks do this, that just insulate themselves from the rest of the world, right? We don't want that. We want to be part of the marketplace of ideas. But I think, I'm not suggesting that the only way to be immune to that is somebody run out and get a degree in philosophy, but at least make themselves open to solid Christian thinkers who are doing that in the same way you would do with your physician. You don't have to go get a degree in medical school to be healthy, but you're tethered to people that do that, and they can help you. So if you want to do that, fine. But otherwise, you have your physician that you're open to. You don't just dismiss, what does he know? He's some kind of elitist studying all that medicine. He's like, well, no, he's in depth, or she's in depth to issues and is filtering it down to you to help you be healthy. And by analogy, I think good philosophy can do that. And it can be, if need be, filtered through so that it's practical and people understand things like avoiding relativism about truth or relativism about morality, or compromised views about God's nature, or hermeneutics. Another thing we haven't mentioned. This is another thing that the postmodernists have polluted, where people are losing their confidence that a written text is even capable of conveying objective truth. My brother, Dr. Tom Howe, wrote his dissertation on objectivity and biblical interpretation on that very thing. And it was startling how many conservative Protestants have, in effect, almost abandoned that there was objective truth that was knowable in the biblical text. It's startling. I was on the campus, the seminary campus, in my office, and these two women came in to see my brother Tom on this issue. And he wasn't in the office that afternoon. And I said, you'll have to settle for Howe number 2. And they said, well, we want to talk to him. And they were both teachers at a Christian high school. And they said, we teach our students apologetics. Man, they know arguments for God's existence and reliability of the Bible and the evidence for the resurrection. They're all, equipped with that. And they go off to university and they get stumbled in their faith in the English department. And I was like, what in the world would happen in an English department that would impact? I could see science or history. I could see that, but English, what was going on? And they said, because in their English department, they're being taught that it's not possible to get objective meaning from a written text. So here are these kids putting 2 and 2 together, go, okay, I guess that means that my Bible, I can't trust it to give me time-honored or eternal and grounded history and facts about God. I can't trust it to do that, because I'm always going to filter what it says through my own life experiences and biases, blah, blah, blah. And they're being stumbled. And you go, wow, whose job was it to watch for that wolf coming in among the sheep? That was the philosopher, because that is a bad philosophical influence, again, of postmodernism. People like Bart Ehrman, for example, and the influences he's having is an example. So somebody has got to help the rest of us be wary enough of it that we can stay philosophically, theologically healthy, so to speak. And so hermeneutics, the nature of God, the sanctity of life. I think all those things can be largely addressed in ways that are antecedent to the text of the scriptures, that we can know them to be true by the nature of reality as God has created it, and the nature of God as its maker. That what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell can ultimately help us discover these cosmic truths about God and his creation.
What would be, for a Christian listening to this, being compelled that, okay, they have to be aware of philosophy at some point? What would be a practical place to start?
So this is particularly significant question with respect to Protestants, because for reasons that had nothing to do with the Protestant Reformation. About, little more than a century or so after the Protestant Reformation, this classical philosophical tradition that I've identified as largely from Aristotle finds its zenith in Thomas Aquinas, began to fade away in Protestantism around the 17th, maybe a little bit later, gradually. But it didn't quite as much do in Catholicism. So unfortunately, then today, if I or you or somebody comes along and extols the value of the metaphysics of this Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, that is Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas, that we come and extol the value of that for Christian thinking, then to a Protestant ear, it sounds Catholic. Understandably so, because most of the places you find it now in higher institutions, higher learning, are just at the Catholic schools. Protestants aren't really doing that. So I have to try to ease the discomfort that my fellow Protestants might feel to go, okay, you realize this has nothing to do with the Protestant Reformation, because researchers like Richard Muller, in his magnum opus, his big 4-volume set, Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, and people like J.V. Fesco in a smaller book on apologetic method against the sort of predominance of Van Til in the United States, less doughy-veered and stuff, but still a tributary from the Kuyper tradition, has really dominated American Reform thinking. And we're trying to make the argument, this is a departure from your own Reform heritage. You read people like Martin Bucer or Peter Martyr Vermigli, even the Institutes of Calvin, they're extolling some of these data points that you find in this classical tradition. So we have to get them over that allergy that they understandably have. And it's changing. It's interesting in the U.S., and you can tell me whether it's the same in South Africa, but in the U.S., the biggest critics of this classical tradition, as I call it, sort of euphemistically, it sounds sort of innocent, just call it classical, but I mean this Aristotelian Thomism, or really more Thomism than anything else. But when the biggest detractors of that in the U.S. are in the Reformed community, but the biggest defenders of it too are also in the Reformed community. People like James Dolezal or David Haynes, for example. And even some in the Lutheran tradition, like Jordan Cooper and others. And of course, I mentioned Robert Muller. So that's a barrier we have to get over of even trying to make the case. And so the place to start, in my judgment, the place to start would be some really good cookies on the bottom shelf level explanations. What is this tradition? So one of them is by a guy named Daniel Sullivan. And it's an introduction to philosophy. It's a small little paperback. And it may even, for all I know, be somewhere in digital form on the internet. I haven't looked, but it may even be as a PDF. But he basically unpacks this. Another one is Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R. It looks like Fesser, but it's pronounced Phaser, like in Star Trek, the weapon in Star Trek. I guess they waved it. That was a lightsaber. I guess they pushed the button for the phaser. And it's just titled Aquinas. It's one of a multi-volume small paperback series called Beginner's Guides. So he does a great job of just getting the cookies on the bottom shelf, as I said, of this tradition, this classical tradition. It's going to be something a person will have to almost always deliberately go look for, because it won't be the standard topic of study in a given Anglo-American, at least, philosophy department. It just won't. I mean, you'll have your obligatory reference to Aquinas here and there, but it's not going to be the mindset of contemporary analytic philosophy. So if you go get William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland's Philosophical Foundation for a Christian Worldview, which I recommend as a great resource, but it will explicitly reject this classical tradition in some strategic points because they're analytic. And maybe they're right, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, that's part of the discussion. I'm just saying the default is not going to be this classical tradition in most resources that Christians would avail themselves to today. So you're going to have to deliberately go through and then make up your own mind. You may end up thinking that Craig and Moreland are right. I mean, they're both brilliant Christians and they both love God as much as you and I do, and they love his word as much as we do. So it's not in that level. It's not a believer unbeliever thing. It's just Christians disagreeing. But I'm lobbying for at least the classical tradition to get a broader hearing in people. That's why I bring it up whenever I can in all the presentations that I do that allow me to do that.
Are there any public intellectuals or popularizers or podcasters that you would recommend?
Yeah, so Carl Trueman has written some great stuff. He's got some lectures on Matthew Barrett, and of course James Dolezal. Some of his. I don't know that he has his own podcast, but he's been, like I am, a guest with a YouTuber, and he's got some great stuff out there. I could probably think of more, but just those three would be a great. Oh, J.V. Fesko, Fesko, and then Robert Mueller. Both have lectures on YouTube that I think are great. There are other sources that would be more Catholic. And so the problems that I have there is in those instances where they don't disentangle the theological distinctives of Catholicism from their metaphysics. They just this is kind of all woven in together. And so I regret that only for my fellow Protestants to read, because then you have to kind of go, well, I'm not so keen on the bodily assumption of Mary or the real presence to this in this exact way in the Eucharist. You might disagree with some of those things, or the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, which was a big thing to Aquinas. They go, I gave a paper in South Africa and on Aquinas, the legacy, and on the 750th anniversary of his death, which is this year. And I felt compelled to let my fellow Protestants know where I thought he was wrong, philosophically and theologically. Only one thing philosophically, but a whole bunch philosophically. But I mean, a whole bunch theologically. But some of those YouTubers like that are great resources in their books, especially people like Carl Trueman, and his treatment of intellectual history has been very spot on in some respects, I think.
Well, I hope the audience have been taking notes so that they can rewind the video or the audio podcast a bit and take note of those resources and get yourself educated. I think just based on personal
by the way,
experience.
I want to interrupt you, Reno, because I would be remiss, and my fellow seminarians would just spank me upside the head if I did not mention Norm Geisler. I'm thinking of more people that were on my radar screen recently, but Norm Geisler's got a book called Thomas Aquinas, An Evangelical Appraisal, which is it's on the cusp of a new edition coming out posthumously, because Geisler's gone on to be with the Lord. And then his systematic theology is just unsurpassed. It's a huge 4-volume set, but there's also a 1-volume edition. So forgive me for backtracking back to that subject as you were trying to wind things up. But I would be castigated for not mentioning Geisler, especially in his systematic theology on theology proper. There's nothing out there that's better, in my judgment, when he deals with the attributes of God in his theology proper, because he grounds it in this classical realism, or this metaphysical realism, or Thomism as it's called.
Yeah, and that reminds me, another person that you didn't mention that I think would be a great resource for the audience, just to help them engage with ideas in the world, would be your friend Frank Turek and his podcast.
Absolutely. Yes, if you ever get a chance, either in person or on YouTube, to see his entire I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, it is riveting. And I know Frank's been to South Africa. We've worked together down there in the Cape Town area some years ago, but it's on YouTube as well. So he has a podcast, he has radio, internet radio, and then a lot of YouTube broadcasts, or a lot of YouTube's videos on. So yeah, he's great. He's a master at Q&A. I mean, he's just in one or more college campuses, university campuses a week, it seems like, giving his presentation, and then just anything goes as far as questions. And Frank's he's one of our graduates. He's a feather in the cap of Southern Evangelical Seminary. And he and people like Elisa Childers is one of our students, and we're proud of the their instance. And I could name more instances where the student has become greater than his master, so to speak, that are out there really fighting the good fight in spreading the truth of the kingdom of God. It's just, yeah. So Frank Turek, definitely.
Yeah. And what I was trying to say is people should really take note of these resources and actually educate themselves, because I think there's a responsibility. We mentioned Colossians 2 verse 8 earlier, and I think there is a lot of deceitful, empty philosophies out there that take people captive. And I think the loving thing for Christians to do is to be responsible, take up the mantle.
Absolutely.
Kind of take up the mantle and help their fellow brothers out.
Absolutely. I mean, and it again doesn't mean you have to run out and get your doctorate in philosophy or theology or whatever sphere of influence God has put you in, given you friends, family, chance encounters with strangers, to whatever level of faith God has given. We all have different measures of faith and aptitudes and interests. And so you don't have to be Frank Turek to be part of the army. Because God has a place for all of us at various levels. And there are things out there I couldn't even begin to think about doing that some of your viewers do as a matter of course every day. And that's their part in fighting the good fight. So we're all in this together to spread the love of God around the world and get as many people in on it as possible before Judgment Day. Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. Well, Dr. Howe, thank you very much for this episode. That brings us to an hour. I enjoyed it a lot, and I think the audience would have as well.
Thanks, Reno. I appreciate it so much. And anytime that anybody thinks I can do something for them, at richard@richardghowe.com, or better, info at richardghowe.com. That'd be a better one. It goes to both Rebecca and me. Got questions about anything or any resources that I have or I can recommend, just please feel free to email me anytime, and I'll do anything I can to help.
That sounds great, and I will definitely link your website in the description, and same as last time, I will link SES in the description as well if people want to check you guys out.
Thanks.
To the audience, this is Hey Culture. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm Rena Fermor, and this is Hey Culture.